Hi, I'm Will Bruin, and I was just recognized as a Seattle Sounders legend. Now I get to do voice reads for the Sounder at Heart podcast network.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
What a save by Fry! The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Rui Diaz through the middle to crown it for Seattle! And now they truly can start the celebrations. It's the Sounders MLS Cup.
Nico Ladero leaves absolutely no doubt! The Sounders rule the region! Seattle Sounders is campeón! It's gone! They're gone! Finally!
This feels fucking awesome.
This is a tiny dog.
Nice work on your little yacht thing.
And Portland can't say shit.
You know, what was the thought process in terms of who you decided to use and who you didn't?
Ever since Sounder at Heart wrote a commentary that we didn't take Overcome seriously.
This episode of Nos Arietes is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Arietes since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest. Welcome back to another episode of Nos Arietes, part of the Sounder at Heart podcast network. I am Jeremiah O'Shan. Joining me today is my pleasure, a friend of mine that I've been wanting to get onto the pod for a while, Charlie Boehm. You know him from MLSsoccer.com. He's one of their more featured writers there at this point, and also just like a genuinely good human being who, I'll catch you maybe by surprise here. Almost everyone in the soccer writing world has very kind things to say about you, Charlie. It's it's a little surreal. You're like friends with everybody, it seems.
There's got to be some haters out there, but they have not made themselves known.
Not in the industry, I don't think.
How lucky am I? I must not be going hard enough.
Right. You know, I'll tell you, one of the proudest moments. One of my proudest moments was recently. You were on Scuffed, and Vince, when you were on, and Vince said to you that you and I were like the two people who have been helping. And I was like, that is some great company to be included with, from Vince and Charlie in the same. I was like, it totally caught me by surprise, but it was an awesome little feather in my
too.
cap.
What an honor, man. Vince is a real one.
I know. I love him. But anyway, Charlie, thank you for doing this. We're going to try to do sort of a regular show, but before we get into that, I do want to introduce our audience to you a little bit more. I don't know if everyone is going to know too much about you, and I'm curious too. How did you get your start in this industry?
I'll try to be less boring and lengthy than the story generally requires, but this was a side hustle for me for a long time. I guess like many others. I'm now middle-aged, but in the early years of internet soccer, I responded to a gig posting on SoccerNet. If the oldies who remember, before ESPN FC, there was SoccerNet.com, and they were looking for writers in MLS markets. And this was back in 2004.
Ooh,
God, I'm old. Yeah, and so there was a whole convoluted situation where a guy was building a network of writers, and then he was selling our content to originally on multiple sites, and it ended up becoming the league website sort of network of coverage. So back then, we're going way back here. I was writing for MLSnet.com, and I made
I remember that.
couple hundred to occasionally a low. If things were really good, you could maybe make, not at the start, but by the end, maybe things you could make low four figures a month, maybe if your team was good and played lots of games. But it was basically for a long time, MLS Net, and then afterwards MLS Soccer, which the rebrand was in 2010, had a beat writer at every single game. For a while, it was even
that's how I got my start too.
There you go. There's many people who have done good stuff in the business got their start with this, but wasn't a full time, but it was something where I had a K Street public relations job that allowed me to go take long lunches once a week and cover DC United as a side hustle. And in somewhere around 2013 or so, I was able to sort of shift things and take a flyer at a full-time life doing this. And I'm consider myself very fortunate to still be here a decade later now. Well,
Charlie, that is it's fascinating. I didn't know that you went that far back in this industry, but yeah, the old network of MLS beat writers at MLS Soccer was kind of an underappreciated, I think that got a lot of people in this industry got their starts there. That and SB Nation, which I also obviously came through, but like those were, without those two places, I don't know where this industry would be, because that's like, between those two places, it's a very high percentage of people who sort of cut their teeth being able to sort of pretend to be full-time writers.
Yeah, we really date ourselves too, and we explained to young people that there was a time when you couldn't just watch a 3-minute highlight pack to see how your team did in your last game. One, you might not have had the option to watch your team on TV, because it was relatively recently in the grand scheme of things that you could get most, let alone all, MLS games on a television broadcast or on cable or whatever online. Right. And so they asked us to write up recaps and ciders. And it was like, you'd write a recap that you'd follow up the whistle of what happened. And then you go downstairs and talk to players and coaches and do a cider afterwards. And that was the job.
Yeah, I know. It was the other thing that's kind of funny. People don't always appreciate this, is that for all the negative press around the current state of soccer journalism in particular, is that you don't have to go that far back when there was just almost no soccer journalism. Like, there were not full-time people working in this industry. Most newspapers weren't sending beat writers out. I mean, most newspapers still don't send beat writers out to a lot of these teams on a daily basis, but it used to be worse. There used to be even fewer outlets that covered this. There were very few national publications that covered it with any serious rigor, let alone beat coverage. And so I sometimes have to remind people that we can still be better. Things can still improve, but you don't have to go that far back to look at a time when, this league was almost, playing in a vacuum. Like, it was barely accessible outside of the most like hardcore fans. But anyway,
very true.
I'm glad that you've been able to make this journey with all of us.
Indeed.
So yeah, we let's get into a little bit more of what I would say the normal show. This is going to be a busy stretch for the Sounders. All of a sudden, I don't feel like we oftentimes do these early week shows that are sort of framed around. We have this conceit that we've been calling how the West will be won, and we kind of go through the Western Conference. We're not going to quite do the exhaustive look at the Western Conference, but we are going to take a little bit broader look. But let's start with the Sounders, who are coming out of a 1-0 win over Dallas. I've been saying for weeks that this was a must-win game for the Sounders. They have this very busy stretch. This game against Dallas, I felt like, was a must-win, in part because it was a team they should beat, but also they're in a situation where they need to win home games, and they got the job done. They only won 1-0. It was on a penalty. I would say in the run of play, I thought that they were okay, even if the result was not exactly in the way that you would want. But at the same time, it left some room for questioning a few things, not the least of which, there's a lot of injuries on this team that are starting to pile up to key players. Last week, they were missing Jordan Morris. They were missing Danny Musovski. That led to Jesus Ferreira getting the start up at the number 9. Then in the game, they lost Yamar. They were already missing Jackson Reagan. A few of those players look like they're going to be coming back soon. But what do you make of where the Sounders are sort of right now as we record this on Tuesday, May 27th?
Yes. So there's this funny pattern. I think you guys locally there and we nationally tend to fall into with the Sounders this year in particular, and over going back some time now, arguably a decade or more, which is just that there's such the atmosphere around this team and this club is so different or so far ahead of the MLS norm that for someone like me, like I feel very like factually grounded in saying like the expectations are fundamentally higher. The norm, sort of the mean is just ahead. And that leads to sort of a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of listeners being unsatisfied by me saying, things are going better than you think. Like when you look at what's happened, how poor things were at the start of the season, how many serious injuries, how many nagging injuries, how much disruption there's been to any attempt to have anything like a first choice 11 that can start and work together and build understanding match day after match day, right? There's been so much disrupting that and so much sort of adaptation that's had to take place. And they still control the almost every game they're in. They are still typically the better team in terms of underlying numbers, eye test, or some combination thereof. And there's still players that are important players that are really short of, I think, the realistic ceiling you could expect them to reach at some point this season or beyond. So, a game like that where you say, all right, that's a Dallas team that's drifting a bit right now, that is much further away from their true selves than the Sounders are. They should be put to the sword, and you let them hang around and so forth. But I think you have to take a result like that and move forward, because we're in the time of year now where the matches really pile up, and the direction of the season starts to, I think, really be set with the results you get or don't get, over the next few weeks and couple months. And then, of course, I'm saying that, being fully aware that there's this rather large, rather exceptional Club World Cup expedition that is going to dominate everything around SSFC in just a matter of days, really.
Yeah, you bring up how much change the Sounders have gone through on a week-to-week basis, basically. And I actually keep track of how many changes they make from one game to the next. They're averaging four changes a game, which seems really high to me. They've only had one game this year where they were able to start the exact same lineup back to back. And this game they only made one change, which is, that's only like the third or fourth time this year that they even only had to make one change, which is like to say they will, lots of teams will make one change for any number of reasons, not necessarily health, not necessarily form, whatever. Right. But the Sounders are routinely making 3-4 changes because of a variety of circumstances, not the least of which is also fixture congestion. But what do you make of the Sounders' depth at this point? Is it, I think that's a common thing that we oftentimes debate within our own community is, because I'll say something like, this is one of the deepest teams in the league. And then as soon as they slip up, they go, oh, I thought we had the deepest team in the league. It's like, well, deepest team in the league doesn't mean that our second choice 11 can go toe to toe with the first choice 11 of one of the best teams in the league.
Yeah, I really just think it's such a sturdy 11 from week to week, generally speaking, and a sturdy roster in general. And it was done in a way that's maybe more uncommon than it should be in MLS. And I recognize I'm tapping into a very well-established debate in Sounder at Heart country here about Craig Weibel and what he's doing or not doing, and the sort of the enduring, I guess, organizational preference for steak over sizzle. And that leads to, I think, a vague sense of dissatisfaction with like perceived lack of ambition or the lack of pizzazz that a Jesus Ferreira, Paul Arriola winter has compared to, whatever, what Atlanta did or what the Sounders did, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago. So, and I actually wrote, I had a pinch hit for Doyle, Matt Doyle, a week or two ago on the his weekend rap column, and it ended up after the Seattle Portland game, and I ended up sort of doing a Albert Rusnak rhapsody, and I basically said, and I sort of figured this occurred to me as I'm writing the blurb, right, and it was, wow, like Rusnak is doing for the modern Sounders what Nico Ladero did for the, can we say, the salad days, maybe peak Sounders, peak MLS Sounders. and yet it's more understated. And he didn't arrive. He arrived from Real Salt Lake, not was it Boca Juniors? I think is where he came from.
Where
Ladero came from. Yeah, and so I get that that's like, you know, and it was so dramatic, right? And of course, Ladero arriving in midseason and going from out of the playoff places to winning MLS Cup, and like there'll never be anything as sexy as that and as dramatic as that, I think, or it'll be difficult to top. But you have the same, I think you have the same level of player who's providing the same level of designated player quality and leadership and performance. It's just that it doesn't feel the same way, and you just I guess my advice would be, you know, be careful about chasing the dragon, right? And just remember that,
right,
you know, different moments and different times may call for different things and feel different.
Yeah, you know, I oftentimes we this is another thing that we sort of go back and forth on, and I'm not necessarily asking you to weigh in on this, but I do think it's a kind of a funny thought exercise, is that, you know, the Sounders have been one of the best teams essentially every year of their existence. And, you know, you can, sometimes it's one of the 10 best, sometimes it's one of the 2 or 3 best. Very rarely have they've really never, the argument has always been, they've never been the undisputed best team in the league. Even when they won MLS Cup, there was, you know, other teams that could make a viable case for being better teams on a, you know, either over the course of the season or even on a given day. And there's some, I don't know, I guess there's some angst about never being the best. And at one point I asked Garth Lagerwey about that, and he said, you know, to some degree that's kind of by design. Like the way that the Sounders build their roster is never going to be where we push all our chips onto the table and say, look, if we're going to put the best possible team we can put out there, because the nature of MLS is that if you do that, there is a cost associated with it. And so like we're seeing that cost sort of, you know, right now in LA, where they went from being probably the best team in the league last year. I think you can make that credible argument, even though they weren't the Supporters Shield winner. They were right up there at the top. And then they obviously just kind of cut through the playoffs pretty much like a hot knife through butter. And I do think that it's been overstated the degree to which MLS has just sort of like crushed them this year, in terms of like, it's all MLS's fault that they're as bad as they are. But there is also some truth to the fact that, or to the argument that MLS's rules do make it tough to go all in and suffer no consequences, because you inherently have to make choice. If you go all in, you're making some choices about what's going to happen to you in the future. And with LA, you know, the bill came due almost immediately, because, you know, they had whatever, we don't need to get too deep into this, but they had a top U22 player who was aging out of that program. They had players who were due bonuses. They had players who were, you know, they were going to that they had essentially, you know, agreed to re-sign at higher numbers. And then of course they had this catastrophic injury to Ricky Puig, who, you know, now you're short a designated player. And I think, you know, we can go back and forth as to like how much of that could they have mitigated with better decision making. But there's also truth to the idea that they had to make all these choices, and the Sounders have kind of just not had to like put themselves in the situations where they don't have to make those choices. And
yeah, so first of all, the Galaxy, yeah, they went all in. They, you know, I think Kuntz was honest about that at the time, and now afterwards, that there's risk associated with that. There's inherent risk associated with being a heliocentric team. The team is built around a very special, rare skill set, of a very special, rare type of player that doesn't turn up, you know, for 30 times a year for every team to get one of their own, in Ricky Puig. And we've seen this with a lot of other teams too, right? I mean, the Minnesota had this phase where they put all their chips in on a mercurial sort of do everything right. Number 10 that was going to make everything work. And there's been other examples around the history of the league, and there's just risk built into that. And I think Sounders have explicitly steered away from that sort of risk, because they haven't. And when Doyle and I were talking that weekend, texting or Skype or Slacking or whatever, like we were just marveling at that pass that Christian Roldan played to set up the goal against Portland. Just like insane 70-yard through ball that leads to a beautiful Rusai goal. And it was like, I just said, they've just got a bunch of just really good MLS guys that they've just stockpiled up there. And he said, yeah, it's a weakest link theory, right? And that's the Galaxy cannot do that. You cannot have a backup to Ricky Puig. Like, we all suspected that, and the reality has come to pass that you cannot, over an extended period of the greater part of a season, and it looks like it's going to be anything close to what you are without this player that you are with him. And there's just risk built into that. And I'm going to push back a little bit because I'm old. And so I remember that the Sounders have been the best team in this league. The Sounders have won a Supporter Shield. In fact, they won a Supporter Shield US Open Cup double a little over 10 years ago.
That's true. And
everybody was pissed off at the end of the season. Everybody was pissed off.
Right. No, I agree. I agree. And you can't.
Because the LA Galaxy won MLS Cup.
But the LA Galaxy
weren't win MLS Cup.
That's true. I agree. But the argument that year would have been, well, the Galaxy were only 1 point worse than the Sounders. So were the Sounders really better than the Galaxy that year? And
they get a trophy for being better. Yes, they were better.
I agree. Look, I'm just giving you the the narrative story out there. But I agree. You make a fair point. There was a run, and they were in that. Along the same argument, they were sort of built around two of these type of players that year. They were built around Dempsey and Obafemi Martins, who at the time could credibly stake claim to being two of the best players in the entire league. But you bring up Albert Rusnak, and we may as well talk about this a little bit more. He had another goal this week. He now has 7 goals, 3 assists. I went and looked this up because I was curious, because someone had insisted that he's not a top 30 player in the league, and I thought that doesn't seem right to me. And so I kind of looked up the stats, and he's top 10 in MLS. He's actually the 8th best player in terms of both non-penalty goals plus assists and overall goals plus assists, meaning the penalties don't end up making a difference where he sits in these standings. Over the last 2 seasons, he has been, I think, last year he was never really mentioned among the MVP contenders, I think in part because there were just some outrageous talents that were having amazing seasons last year. So I'm not sitting here saying he should have been considered for MVP last year, but right now it does feel like he's sort of putting together an MVP caliber type season. This week it was only a penalty that he had this week, but he again was in the middle of a bunch of really good chances, and he just seems to be playing with a ease and a calmness and a confidence that is really maybe even better than what we saw from him at his best last year.
Yeah, and I can't remember if it was my best 11 last year or the year before, and I should really be able to remember more clearly. But I remember going through this process, and I actually do put in thought into my best 11, and too much thought, of course, too much time. but I do try to make at least a nod to being a functional team. And then the league's designations of players' positions sometimes make it a little harder. And I remember having being stuck where I had too many attackers or something, and I had to adjust my initial 11. And and when I went back through it a few times, it ended up that I had Rusnak in it, and I was sort of like, okay, wait, is there someone? And I was like, wait, is there someone better than him he's taking a spot of? And it's sort of the more I looked at it, and I sifted through the numbers and stuff, and looked at the team performances, and it's like, no, I mean, really, I got here backwards, but this is absolutely a best 11 player. I mean, where is that team, that consistently, chronically competitive team without him? And I just don't, again, you can say that they have some credible alternatives if he's out for a length of time or whatever, but I just don't think that they get close to their ceiling or play the way they want to play, the way that Brian Schmetzer wants them to play on a week-to-week basis. If you don't have him, and I don't think he's a very easy person to replace either in the domestic or international markets.
Yeah, and I that was another funny thing this offseason that, going back to the whole Craig Weibel discussion, was the Sounders sort of made a decision that we wanted Rusnak back, and we're willing to spend, we would love to get him for less than a DP salary, but we also understand that he might demand a DP salary, and we would be crazy to act as if he doesn't deserve that. And as is his right, he was like, well, this is what I'm worth. Why would I take less than I'm worth? I want the money. And to his credit, he's absolutely proving that he is at least worth that, if not maybe even more in terms of raw money, but he's absolutely worth a DP spot. and he is, he's performing like it. I think I also appreciate that he has this sort of vibe about him that is just very, it's a quiet confidence. He's willing to speak his mind, but he's not boastful. But there was which also kind of made his goal celebration in this game funnier because it was a penalty in May and he rips his shirt off, he balls it up, and he throws it into the crowd, which I don't think I have ever seen. I'm not sure I've ever seen a player actually throw his jersey into the stands while the game is very much still being contested. And to his credit, Alex Roldan realized that he's going to need that. And so he goes back into the stands. He asks the fan for the jersey back. The fan gives him the jersey and we all go on. And as it turns out, I guess the Sounders had a backup plan. If he had to wear a blank jersey, he would have worn a blank jersey, but he didn't have another. And it's just a very funny situation. And I will note, best as we can tell, Albert after the game went and then gave the fan the jersey back. So it all worked out in the end. But we sort of asked him what was going on with you there? And he's just I was just so frustrated. The game wasn't going how I wanted it to go. And all these, and it's I didn't even realize that was inside of you, Albert. But it was kind of good to see, in a weird way, good to see that he had that level he had that sort of intensity ready to go, ready to fire when it needed to be mined.
This is one of the things that I think keeps me in love with the game too. And trying to talk about it and write about it in a reasonably compelling way, which is that fundamentally these are human beings, are not widgets. They're not stats packages. They can change and evolve and grow, and you never quite know what you're going to get. And he happened to have a really good year in a contract year. And if there may have been, I think, maybe a little bit of a perception of him, because I think he did something similar at RSL, where it's okay, maybe this guy's got the NBA syndrome where he has his best year in a contract year, and
he mentioned
that
last
from him
week.
After.
He actually mentioned that was a narrative. It was I don't remember exactly how it came up, but he said, I don't know, there was this narrative out there that I only care about performing when I'm in a contract year, but I don't know where that came from. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but on the one hand, get the bag, right? You do what's necessary, but there is this sort of in sports in general, there's this perceived phenomenon on some psychological level, and it sure seems like he's either outgrown it or it wasn't there in the first place, or there was mitigating circumstances, because he's producing a really high level consistently, right? Even that you're not going to get the exact same level from any player every single week. They're not always going to be at their peak, but it's as close as they can get, and that's what separates the good from the great. And I think he's there, man. I just do. And again, I know, the Sounders probably have some games where they've dropped points. They should have won a game like that, maybe by a safer margin, but the amount of control this team exerts in most of their games on a week-to-week basis is the kind of, educated eye test, maybe, I think that suggests that that they're going to be in the running when it's business time, because they are able to, and they have different clubs in the bag, right? But I like the way they go about things, and the experience and the organizational memory and all these factors that lead you to trust that a team is going to produce when it really matters, and going to be in there in the fall when the games really start to pick up in intensity. And I think we'll see them there again.
Yeah. You go back to just to kind of piggyback on what you said about their sort of dominance in week to week. Another stat I keep track of is field tilt, which, for people who don't know, it's essentially measuring the final third entries on each team and which team is spending more time than the other team's half, really, or they're attacking third, I believe, specifically. And the Sounders have only had less than 60% four times and only less than 50% twice. And that's they average 62% field tilt. They are, they're winning the XG battle almost every week. There's a kind of another stat kind of that, people can make of it what they will, called expected points. And they and essentially what it does is it takes all the chances that each team created, it plays 1,000 1,000 simulated games, and it kind of spits out a number of points you'd expect each team to get. And a team never ends up with 3, and it almost never ends up with 0 as a result of this 1,000. I think it's like a Monte Carlo style simulation. And the Sounders are they're over 1.5 almost every game, which means that they're, at least expecting to get a result. Essentially, they've only been under 1 point, I believe, twice all year. They're probably the games that you would, the LAFC game where they got blown out, and then I believe the San Diego, or actually it may have been it was the Salt Lake game, I guess, was the other one where they were below 1. But anyway, it's been a really consistent season, I think, is the case that we're making here. And that's despite, one of their biggest offseason acquisitions, Paul Arriola, going down with an injury very early in the season. And he was looking like he was going to be a real, it wasn't necessarily billed as a huge move in the offseason, but once the season started, it was pretty obvious that he was probably the bigger of the two acquisitions they had made in the offseason from Dallas. And instead of sort of like they've essentially were able to replace him with Ryan Kent. And as it is, you have a Ryan Kent feature coming out. Ryan Kent has been, I think, a very impressive player through his first, I think, 7 games that he's played for the Sounders. He has essentially established himself as a starter at this point. And when he's at his best, he is a seemingly almost unplayable type of winger. Like when he is on, he is making moves. He is beating opponents off the dribble. He's seeing passes that really, like, no hyperbole, like other players just do not see a lot of the passes that he's been making so far. He almost had another one this week when he set up Georgie Manungu on a play that I will say was correctly ruled offside, but it was a great pass nonetheless. Anyway, what you had a chance to actually sit down with him and have a one-on-one conversation, which I'm a little jealous of. I haven't actually had a chance to do the one-on-one thing with him yet. What did you make of Ryan?
Yeah, well, I hope I have a good story for Sounders fans to read in a couple of days. We chatted for about half an hour earlier today, and I come away very impressed and sort of intrigued. And again, I don't think there's a lot of use in directly comparing him to Paul Arriola, but it's pretty incredible that you have at least a push, possibly an upgrade, in just, if we talk a bit in general terms about the winger position, after having to scramble, right, to compensate for a very early, very painful and brutal season-ending injury for Paul. And it turns out there's a little bit of an inside connection here, because Ryan himself said, I think people will be surprised at some of the clubs that were reaching out, because he'd gone to, first of all, we're talking about a Liverpool wonderkind here. The guy, if you go back,
what
and
year
Google him,
how old was he when he started at Liverpool?
Age 7. This is a guy who's in the Liverpool system from 7 to I believe he was 18 or thereabouts, but and was a Klopp favorite. I mean, it appears that Jurgen Klopp and Steven Gerrard as well he moved on to Rangers eventually and was playing under Gerrard, and was well liked by both those managers, and I think was really close. And but for maybe a poorly timed injury or two, and just a ferociously competitive squad in an elite club, not quite getting his chance at Liverpool, but also wanted to play regularly and moved on by his own choice to go somewhere in Rangers where he could play and play in big games and play in Europe and so forth. So and seemed to be, he's an England youth international and really a star on the rise, and then ends up making a move to Turkey that most definitely did not work out for him, that turned into a nightmare rather quickly, left him sidelined and training on his own for long periods, not playing first team matches for long periods, and had his contract mutually voided and torn up in, I believe it was October of last year. But part of the terms of this was that he had to wait until the next transfer window to make a move. And he said he turned down Premier League clubs. I didn't know that he actually had to, that he was forced to sit out for part of that time. And granted, I'm just going on what we, the conversation we had, and I haven't dug into the minutiae of the deal or whatnot, but He had some time to pick his next move, and he had clubs in, playing in European and UEFA level competitions. He had Premier League clubs that were interested, but he said that this opportunity really called to him. He'd been to the US a few times on preseason tours and on holidays, and actually talked about MLS with Stevie Gerrard, which is kind of, I had to ask, like, how did that happen? But it just turned out just kind of a mentorship thing where he was having discussions about life and soccer and his career with Gerrard, and Gerrard talked about his time and said, "You've got to go do this. You've got to experience this."
Interesting. Which
is somewhat interesting, right? Because you could very easily imagine Gerrard saying something very different, because he did not have the best of times in MLS, a strictly individual performance level. But apparently it stuck with him enough in a positive way for him to speak positively in that way. And then, as it so often does with so many things Sounders, Andy Rose enters the picture, because he knew Andy Rose from their time together at Coventry City many, many moons ago. He's had a loan stint, I believe, when he was at Liverpool at Coventry. And so he had someone that he knew and trusted that could give him the rundown on the club and what things are like and the culture. And so that was what he picked. So that it was a pretty great midseason reinforcement. And there's, I kind of thought coming into it, I thought maybe there must have been some element of utility to this for both sides, but it certainly looks like he had options and wanted to try this. And he seems very, very settled and intrigued by life in Seattle and life in MLS in general. And he's an interesting guy, because he looks, and in some ways on the pitch looks like a sort of a prototypical English winger.
Yeah.
But he doesn't think like one, and he's made choices to be different and to get out of the country and get away from home and have different experiences and different adventures in his life and his career. And I think that speaks well of him and bodes well for his Sounders future, as well as this very promising start he's gotten off to.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, have sort of assumed that this was sort of a last chance saloon type situation where he was down on his luck and he just needed someone to make an offer. But that doesn't really seem to, there's no evidence that that's actually, no actual, other than circumstantial evidence. There's no one on any side is saying this. You can watch him play, and it doesn't make any sense that this is a guy who just needed someone to give him a chance. It seems to be like, and he said this to us when we have talked to him, is that he just needed someplace that he wanted to like enjoy his football again, that he wanted to feel unburdened by the expectations that have frankly carried. I think this happens a lot in English football, especially when you become a kind of wonderkind and you are identified at a young age, that it's very helpful, obviously, early on in your career. And then almost as quickly as it's helpful, it can become sort of a negative where you're not living up to the expectation. And now all of a sudden you're this, even if you are a good player, you're maybe not meeting the level of expectation that others might have for you. And it starts to become sort of a yoke that hangs around a player's neck, a weight that they're carrying from one place to the next. And it seems like that was kind of behind what he wanted to do when he went to Turkey, which was to kind of get out of that particular, maybe that particular light and go somewhere else. And instead it became even worse in some ways, because he wasn't getting the minutes that he was hoping. He had some, I think he had some injury issues there as well, but he definitely wasn't seeing eye to eye with management, and he really fell out of favor, and it became like a kind of an ugly situation. But what I appreciated about him is that he does seem really genuine in the idea that he just wants to sort of play. Like he just wants to have fun. Like he just wants to, and so nothing about him being here strikes me as, look, I just need someplace to get my career back on track, and then I'm going to get out of here as soon as I can.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. And maybe he'll be in a fundamentally different negotiating position in a few months or at year's end. But he did say also that Club World Cup is a factor here. And while I know many listeners, and probably you and I as well, have a fairly checkered, outlook on this tournament, it is still a massive event that it puts every participating club in a different sort of spotlight. And it certainly seems to have played a role in his decision to come to Seattle, because he knew he'd get this experience. And it's not just, it's a big stage upon which individuals can show themselves, or organizations can show themselves and introduce themselves to the world and to new audiences. and you get to play against players you may never otherwise go up against in person in a competitive match. So I think, as much as easy as it's been to dog on that, it certainly seems to have at least been one of several recruiting factors in this one, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, no, it does seem it's been kind of a neat thing. And I also just appreciate he has a personality that doesn't strike me as the typical Englishman. We have not had a ton of typical English play. Andy Rose is one of the more prominent Englishmen who have played here. And even Andy Rose is not a typical Englishman, in part because he went to college in the United States and he is almost as much American at this point as he is English in terms of his sort of general outlook. But that little connection there it was part of what I found interesting about that connection is that their time at Coventry did not actually overlap that much. I don't know that they actually played in a game together, but clearly they had some level of connection because Andy wasn't just a nameless, faceless former teammate. He was apparently someone who Kent felt comfortable taking some level of feedback from in terms of like vouching for the Sounders, if nothing else.
Yeah, which is, again, you never know, right? It's football world can be big and global and huge, and it can also be feel like a small neighborhood in some ways where with gossip and rumors and personal networking is so important. And I thought some of the most striking stuff that Kent said was about just he sounds very happy here because I think he feels that the relationships and the interactions he's had with everyone at the club are just more straightforward and sincere than what he dealt with in Turkey. And I think he was at a big club in Turkey, but things turned really quickly. He was made to train on his own. And he, at some point when things went bad, there was, significant organizational heft was thrown into sort of making him feel unwelcome, and the political aspects of a big club really grated on him. And I think we can say from afar, like, became this cul-de-sac in his career that he had to navigate his way out of. So I'm sure there's a number of factors that have some element of fortune to them for him to wind up here. But at this point now, I mean, just looks like a really great signing because it's all the things we talked about. And then his particular toolkit seems to be well adapted or well suited to MLS. And I think it's the type of player that maybe the Sounders team needed in terms of just the directness as well as the skill that he has and the ability to execute in a physically powerful way, in a repeatable way. And then it seems like he's got the durability to deal with turf and long travel and all these other uniquely MLS challenges.
Yeah. Did you talk to him about the travel situation? He had, I guess, mentioned after the Portland game that he had never, that week ended, the game that ended in Portland was his third road game that week. He had traveled, I don't know, something like 5,600 miles all in. And he had mentioned how he had never been anything like that. And I went and looked it up, and he had never taken a road trip that was like even half that long in his entire career. And that's, playing in European competition and everything else. And I do sometimes think that the travel element of MLS is sometimes you can tell people like, no, these are long trips. And then there's the reality of that. It's like, no, like every game is like playing European competition. Every road game is like playing in Europe.
He and I didn't get deep into this, but it's such a learning curve, and it's a physiological and psychological line item that just some players can deal with, some can't. But you've got to be able to roll off a plane and get yourself together to play at a high level in a way that's, I mean, maybe they'd have to do that in Russia too, maybe Brazil. Like, there's just not that many places that ask this of you. So, but I think the most successful players, and he seems to have this sense of sort of intrigue and wonder at it rather than annoyance, which again is not traditionally English, right? Because some guys just can't get their head around this completely different way of doing things that probably seems ludicrous if you come from if you have a Eurocentrism or an Anglocentrism to you, whether explicit or implicit. it's going to be harder to get your head around it. But if you look at it as like, and he seems like a guy who's into American culture in general. He was wearing a Yankees hat when we talked.
Yeah, that seems to be a
great.
staple for him. We're going to have to work with that. Work with him on that.
Yeah, exactly. But that helps too, right? Because at the end of the day, if you have an interest in sort of this, whatever this next city that you touch down in,
the American project, as they say.
Right? Yeah. And I think you have to love that part because if you like to travel, this might be the league for you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back and do a little bit bigger of a picture. We are going to get into some of the Sounders' upcoming schedule and sort of the Western Conference in general. But you're listening to Nos Arietes.
Thank you for listening to the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network, which now includes Nos Arietes, Lobbing Scorchers, and the Cooler Guild. We've been independent since August of 2023, but need your support to make sure it continues. Although this podcast is free, it's only made possible by your continued support. Memberships start as low as $25 a year, which not only helps make podcasts like this one happen, but also gets you access to everything we produce. If you're able to support us at higher levels, starting at $75 a year, you gain access to a host of other perks, most notably entry into our members-only Discord, where the smartest, funniest, and most engaged commenters share their thoughts and ideas. To find out more, just visit sounderatheart.com and click the subscribe button in the top right corner. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to Nos Arietes. So we are going to zoom out a little bit more and talk about some of the upcoming opponents that the Sounders have, some of the Western Conference at large. So first up is San Diego FC. This is a game that is being played for some reason at 5:30 p.m. on a Wednesday. This is, as far as I know, the first time the Sounders have ever kicked off a midweek game at home before 7 o'clock. Apparently on purpose. I've done some investigation into this. I'm fascinated by it. This might be kind of an interesting little, we see this in baseball all the time where they play like afternoon games in the middle of the week, usually for travel reasons, but I don't know. You've been to many.
This isn't a Cascadia bank holiday. There's not some local holiday up there.
No.
You guys have? No.
It's very strange. Yeah, exactly. That would be funny if it was sort of like a Flag Day or whatever. What's the thing in Boston that they do that no one else celebrates?
Oh yeah, I'm blanking on it now, but I do
Patriot
remember
Day
there
or
was
something
this.
like that.
Yeah, that sounds right. In DC, Juneteenth which is coming up is a big day. It's like a state. Yeah. It's a district holiday, and so that would be a fun one. Although I remember also there was this infamous experiment that the Red Bulls did. I think we're going back a decade or so, where in midsummer in June or July they did a camp day. So they had it was a Wednesday game that kicked off at 1 o'clock or something, and it was
all
full.
kids.
The stadium was all soccer camps. It was children, just a children's day at the stadium. They're all there as part of this Red Bull soccer camp week or whatever. And they just the players, of course, were, I think, somewhat annoyed to be playing under the daytime sun, but it's possible that you could argue they got a better crowd than they would have gotten at 7:30 on
if it was
Wednesday.
Full,
otherwise, so.
There's not a lot of examples of full Red Bull arena, unfortunately.
Yes, but fans and pundits tend to take a dim view of these sort of things. But I hope that you guys can dig up a little bit of a backstory, because there has to be one. There has to be one. I mean,
yeah, and I think my understanding, one theory I've heard posited by people who are not part of the ticketing office but who are involved in the Sounders, they think it might just be people said they wanted us to try some different stuff. This is one of those experiments, and it's like a happy hour type of deal where it's hey, just get right off of work and come in. I don't know. We'll see if it works. I do feel like maybe there was a Champions League game or something that kicked off pretty early too, but we're getting a little far afield at this point of what I want to talk about, which was.
No, I hope there's drink specials. Go get day drunk before the sun goes down. Right.
Exactly.
Make
I would have loved it as
a day.
If I was not covering this game, I would have been really tempted to use this as an opportunity to go to the game to go to the game when I wouldn't normally be able to go because I'd have to put my kids to bed. And, you could be home by 9 o'clock on a game like this. I think that's pretty sweet on a weekday, but neither here nor there. San Diego FC, is coming to town. They thumped the Sounders 3-0 in the first meeting. They are, I think we can call them the surprise of the season, can't we? I know that pundits were sort of split on how likely they were, but I don't know that anyone really saw. They've been up in the top few of the West almost all season. They are currently second in the West, and they're doing it with a style and a confidence that I think even at their best, St. Louis City, when they were on that expansion year, when they won the West, I don't think they ever looked quite this put together. When LAFC went on their run in 2017, maybe that's the most comparable thing, but this just feels a little different, in part because they aren't doing it with all these superstars. They kind of like everyone that's there, other than maybe Chucky Lozano, was very specifically picked for the role they needed them to play within this larger system. And it's working really well for them.
Yeah, and we have to say too, this is an organization that plans to be sort of a kids FC in the long run, right? They're spending. I don't know how it compares to what I just wrote a piece about Philly's big new academy infrastructure, upgrades. They spent something like 55 million or more on centralizing their whole campus, like the whole academy operation, the school, multiple training fields, indoor stuff is all at Subaru Park now on the Riverside there. And I think San Diego probably, my guess is they're spending even more. A big part of it is they didn't have to build their own stadium, right? They're sharing Snapdragon, which is already there. But they're spending big on building a residential academy facility, and they want to grow their own. They want to recruit Mexican and U.S. kids from both sides of the border. They want to bring in kids from elsewhere in the Right to Dream network. So this is going to be an academy-centered club eventually. So I was thinking that there probably just would be an awkward learning curve until they got there. But they've made a mockery of that. I mean, I think there was a lot of interest about how this team was going to look, but I don't think there was very high expectations for results. And granted, we're still early in the expansion, lifespan, in the sense that there will be a wall. They hit a little bit of a wall. I guess it was in April, but they sort of recovered from that. And again, what it comes down to is, and touching in on the Sounders theme from earlier, is control. Like, they're controlling games. They're not. There was a chaotic element to the press that St. Louis was just ambushing teams with, and it worked very well, but it ultimately was not sustainable. I mean, they sort of tailed off in the fall and then cratered in the postseason that first year, and have been trying to get back to that level ever since. And with San Diego, they're doing stuff at a really high level in terms of patterns of play. I mean, Joe Lowry over at Backfield picked out a moment from one of their goals over the weekend, and we're talking about how, I think their number 6, Vertskov, rotates into basically the striker's position to play the pass that leads to their goal, to Luca De La Torre's goal. And it's like to have the collective understanding, right, for him to recognize that and for everyone else to play off it that quickly in the run of play. This is impressive, right? And this is, especially when you compare it to the norm in MLS, right? And this league is getting a lot more tactical. There's a ton of high level ideas and players and coaches nowadays. So it's vastly improved over the last decade, but it's still rare to see a team do what they're doing week in, week out, and have the composure and the control. I mean, there's a little bit of Columbus Crew here. There's a little bit of, you could argue maybe there's some Seattle or LA Galaxy, at their peak kind of levels of understanding and meshing the talent. But it's amazing. And I interviewed Anders Dreyer a little while back for a feature story, and he's been a big part of this. I think, they've only got 2 DPs. They're on the 2-4 model, and he and Chucky are these sort of bookend wingers who both are inverted. And the idea is for them to combine with each other and understand each other well, and then have runners around them, and then also have the 9 that where they can all interpret stuff together. And it's, considering that there's a pretty disparate group, right? You've got this Danish influence from Nordsjælland, the club that they're affiliated with in Denmark. And then you have these kind of kids they've accumulated from all over MLS and beyond. And then Chucky, is a Mexican international, but also has a lot of European pedigree. And apparently his English is good, because Dreyer said he hasn't had to learn much Spanish. It's like they're communicating English, and they're on the same page much earlier than I expected.
Yeah, they are. Again, it's not just the results that are so impressive. Those results are impressive, but it's the way that they're getting them. But one thing they haven't really had, I'm looking at their schedule right now, and there's a few things that they haven't necessarily, a few tests that they haven't quite passed yet. Now, it should be said, they've so far basically passed every test that you can throw their way. But one of the tests that they haven't really had to do is they haven't had to play on the road on short rest yet, so this will be the first time that they've played on the road on short rest. They also haven't really, I don't know if they have a truly signature win on the road yet. They did beat RSL earlier in the season, which, let's be honest, is something the Sounders have not done in a long, long time. So I don't want to undersell the value of a road win against RSL, but most of their road wins have been against lower table teams. So this is it's a big test for the Sounders also, but it's also a big test for San Diego. Are these legitimate tests? I guess I'm asking you, or are these things that they'll sort of need to check off to be considered elite, or have they already sort of checked that box?
I think the sample size is big enough now. We're 15 games in that we can say that they've, they're not a flash in the pan, but
yeah,
things get real in this, right? We just had Labor Day weekend. Things are about to get real for everyone, especially if you're a Western team and you have to go to Texas and you have to start dealing with altitude and stuff like that. So they're at Seattle, they're home against Austin, then they got to go to Minnesota, Vancouver, and Dallas in quick succession this coming month. So, we know Minnesota are quite good, especially at home. We know Vancouver are an absolute wagon this year. Going to Frisco on June 28th, it's going to be a juicy one there, and that's a different kind of challenge. There's a different sort of mental demand that those 100-degree days in Dallas. As a native Texan, I can attest. And then the summertime grind kicks in, where there's a lot of matches. There's going to be international call-ups. You're going to have to be, I think, maybe a little more pragmatic at times. It's not that I don't think they can do that. I give credit actually for how good they've been in transition. I mean, they have absolutely murdered some teams in transition, so they know how to counter press.
The Sounders, they killed. I mean, in the first meeting, 2 of their 3 goals came out of transition moments, and not in. It was funny. The narrative in that game was, the Sounders press didn't work, and they got pressed into submission by San Diego. But if you actually go back and look at the main moments of that game, it was just San Diego going from defense to attack in a snap, and they did it a lot. They wasn't just the 2 goals that they got. They actually were tearing the Sounders up on the counterattack. But go on. I'm sorry, I interjected there.
Yeah, no worries. But the other thing that I think matters a lot is, again, on a level impressive, considering this is his first stint. This is his first year as a head coach of a first team. Mikey Varas seems to have built a pretty good collective. They've got a belief in it. Dreyer talked about the attraction that he had towards this, being part of an expansion project and being the first for everything, and how much Varas kind of drives that home. This idea that everything we're doing, like, we're setting the culture for the future. We're building something that's going to live on after us, and we're the ones that are doing it. And I think there's something. That's something fairly unique to MLS or definitely to North American soccer in general, that I think is very interesting. We maybe take for granted a little bit some of that stuff just when we're immersed in the league and we're locals, because they really feel a sense of pride, I think, and there's something very special about being the first to do it. And so, when you look, I think Matt Doyle posted the video of Chucky Lozano absolutely busting his ass on a 70-yard recovery run the other day. I think he closed down, it was in the Galaxy game. I think he may have closed down Diego Fagundes to snuff out a transition on a yellow card, runs 70 yards at a full sprint, most of it, and then gets stuck in to get the turnover and get the ball going back the other way. When you have a high-paid, high-visibility star designated player doing that, it just says a lot, and it really does trickle down. So again, this is going to be hard to sustain. There are walls, I think, waiting for them, but man, they're just so far ahead of the curve right now.
Yeah, they really are. It is impressive to see. And, Varus has some, he's gotten a lot of praise from Brian Schmetzer. The Sounders kind of had some relationship with him because he was the coach of the U20s, I believe, during the World Cup, World Cup qualification process where Obed Vargas was getting called in and Reed Baker Whiting was sort of involved in that cohort of players and whatnot. So it's been kind of an interesting, it's just been very interesting to watch from a distance and very impressive. And then after that, the Sounders play the next three. So the Sounders next three games are against the top three teams in the West. It goes San Diego, then home against Minnesota, and then on the road against Vancouver, and then they go into the Club World Cup. Minnesota has been another team who, all three of these teams really have been pretty big surprises, I think. Minnesota, another team who I think most would have said were on the verge of doing something good, but not necessarily special. And here they are sitting, almost halfway through the season, right there at the top of the Western Conference, and doing it in a way that is interesting, I think, is maybe the best way of putting it. This is a team that doesn't really want the ball, but they are leaning into the fact that they have a lot of players who are good in transition, and they are just gashing teams on the counter, and they have a pretty aggressive defense. I think it's maybe been there's maybe a little bit of a misperception that they're sort of a bunker and counter team, but it's not so much a bunker and counter. They are, they're a pretty aggressive defensive team, but the degree to which they don't want the ball is kind of, it's an interesting contrast with San Diego, who really does want the ball a lot.
Yeah. And I think they know, Doyle has banged the drum about this. There is still a limitation here that the teams that generally win things in this league have to have another club in the bag. There has to be some way that you can get your foot on the ball and control things in a different way, but they haven't had to. I watched and covered and wrote about their ambush of Inter Miami, which was possibly kind of like a like dictionary definition demonstration of the strengths of the system, where I think they finished the game with it may have been less than 30% possession, but more expected goals. They just trounced Miami. They exploited all the weaknesses. Like Miami had tons of the ball, but they were slipshod.
27% possession, by the way. They had 27% possession in that game, and they more than doubled Miami's XG.
Right, with a long throw, with set pieces, and it was amazing. It was like it was uncut, like raw, just incredible MLSness, because like the scale of the humbling was so strong, and the collective satisfaction that Minnesota with, like, I know a lot of the fans up there would like to see a little bit more proactive soccer at times, but they're just like, there's such a clear sense of self that where that club connects into the identity of the community, and they've got a great supporter culture, and they were just enjoying the hell out of this, disassembling of Messi's Miami. But even at that, after that, Michael Boxall, who's an incredible quote, as well as being a very dependable MLS center back and a set piece threat, he said, "Look, I get pissed off when we can't connect, 3-4 passes to get out of our own end. Like, we know we can do some things different. We know we can be better with the ball, but I think they've really honed their ability to get forward quickly, to get out of their own end. Like field tilt they can just control field tilt in such a fundamentally different way than, let's say, the Sounders do, because usually it's, whether it's kind of a 3-4-2-1 or a 3-5-2 kind of look, they have different kind of interpretations, but generally they have two front runners, and Oluwaseyi in particular is just an outstanding player in transition. He can get on the end of things. He also sets things up. He's great with his back to goal. They're just so clever at being direct in a precise, calculated way. This is not necessarily route one, although you will see the route one from them sometimes. They are surgically precise, often in how they get from defense into attack. And it requires, I think, a lot of collective organization and mental acuity and mental focus on the part of the opposition to understand what's happening and to be able to deal with it in time.
Yeah, it is sort of an impressive thing that they're doing. I've talked to Doyle about this on the show a few times, and one of the things that I think is fascinating, though, is going back through the history of, we have data on possession that goes back to about 2015, I believe. And there is no examples of teams that have had less than 44% possession. And I mean, literally no examples of teams that have averaged something like, maybe it's 43%, but it's low 40s, but over 40, right? And this is bad teams. This is good teams. This is just across the board. Right now, Minnesota is averaging like 38%. They're on pace to have one of the, just by a large margin, the fewest number of completed. Essentially, what that means, they don't complete a lot of passes, and they're going to complete something like 60 fewer passes per game than like the next least team in MLS, at least from the the 10 years of data or so that we have. And I mean, I guess it's sustainable on some level because they've been doing it now for almost half of a season, but it does seem like they're playing with fire a little bit, and that at some point, even the best counterattacking teams need to be able to hold the ball a little bit. This last week they got 54% possession, which was the season high for them. It was a 1-1 tie against Austin. And I don't know that the Sounders are going to change their approach, but it is a fast. I mean, it's just, I don't even know if there's anything to say. It's just a fascinating approach. And it's sort of like, just, take this concept to its logical conclusion and see what it looks like. And, it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
I mean, this is a league where scouting always sort of pulls you back, right? Teams get found out.
Right.
You do something well enough for long enough that there's a data set that can be analyzed and broken down. And then, your opponents will eventually find the cracks and exploit them. That they haven't really been pushed out of their comfort zone yet. And they may still, but when you're this good at this sort of certain facet of the game, I think it makes you an inherently dangerous tournament team, and the playoffs are a tournament. And I would not be the least bit surprised if they dip back towards the mean for substantial periods of the next, 6 months or whatever it is, 5 months, but then still can have this club in their bag for when, the games are played in 90-minute increments, and everything that's happened up till then is just the prelude, right? And I would be very leery of having to deal with that team in a 1-game situation or a 3-game situation where they can absorb pressure so comfortably for so long.
Yeah. Well, the last team I wanted to pick your brain about is the Vancouver Whitecaps, who are frankly maybe the most fascinating team to be talking about right now. They're going to be playing in the CONCACAF Champions Cup final on Sunday. So that I guess that'll be the last game that they have played when they face the Sounders, is the CONCACAF Champions Cup. They do get, that's good for them. They get a whole week off, regardless of what happens in that game. So that probably is good for them. I don't think there's not a Canadian.
It's crazy that they're playing Minnesota tomorrow at midweek, which is like, that's a wild scheduling thing, considering the league has often helped out the deep runs that teams have made in CCC or CCL.
And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this run that they're on, is that when the Sounders went on their CONCACAF Champions League run, I don't know if you know this, but the Sounders are actually the only MLS team to have won that title in the modern era of the tournament. It's not, no one talks about it, but we do like to remind people of that. Yeah. But the Sounders got a lot of help scheduling wise in that tournament. They moved a bunch of games so that they didn't have to do what Vancouver is doing right now, which is especially, it is almost comical that MLS did not move this game for Vancouver. And then they're going to be missing 9 players for international duty when they face the Sounders. It's probably not going to be the best test. That said, let's talk a little bit about what they've managed to accomplish this year. They have gone through basically the most difficult path they could possibly go through to get to this point. They have beat multiple Mexican team, Liga MX teams. They beat Inter Miami, who of course was, one of the most on paper talented MLS teams in league history, who is coming off a record breaking Supporters Shield run. So they have been done no favors from scheduling. They've been done no favors in terms of luck of the draw. They have all along maintained a Supporters Shield pace in the league, which again, basically unprecedented. This is not even for, say what you will, but the Sounders had a great run. I think all kidding aside, I think sometimes we undersell what the Sounders had to do, but they were not on a supporters. They certainly were not on a supportership run. I believe they were actually off to a kind of a rough start in the MLS regular season. And then on top of that, they've also been playing Canadian championship games. They're on pace to play something like 55 games, I believe, before they're even, it's assuming they don't even, or they're not even playing in Leagues Cup. And that's before you count playoff games. This is an outrageous amount of mileage they're putting on, an outrageous amount of minutes they're playing. They're playing an almost unprecedented level of competition. And yet, talk about tests. They are passing every test with not just flying. I mean, they are acing every test that gets thrown their way. All the while, they lost their big designated player acquisition before the season even started. And, so all Brian White did is rip off the Clark Kent glasses and show up as Superman this year.
Yeah, they lost one DP in the winter, and then they've been absent.
And then they lost Ryan Gold on top of that. You're right.
Player for most of the season, and we were hoping that maybe he'd be fit enough to at least play a role in the final here, because he's reached the end of the slated projected recovery time for the knee injury. But I don't know whether they're just keeping things hush hush or if he just isn't quite there yet. There's been very little coming out. If he's training, they're keeping it under wraps. So it remains to be seen, but probably not much, if anything, from Ryan Gauld, and they're going to have to beat the final boss in Cruz Azul on Sunday without Sebastian Berhalter, who's been their breakout, one of many, but probably the first among the breakouts individual stories. I've never seen anything like it. It's incredible, and we have to remember this is a team
first-year coach, by the way. First year, like on top of everything else, they have a coach who has never been in MLS.
Never been in North America. He had lived in Toronto a bit while his wife was doing she's an oncologist, if I'm remembering correctly. Jesper Sorensen's wife. And so he knew a little bit about North American culture and had lived here briefly, but had never worked here before. It's truly remarkable. And then everything we're talking about, it is eclipsed and then some when you actually watch the games. They're digging deep. They are overcoming the stuff that no MLS team has ever done. I mean, we saw the Sounders produce some real magic in that 22 CCL run, but they were getting absolutely, either demolished or just treading water at best in the league, right? And they eventually didn't make the playoffs. And granted, it's the only time that it's happened in their MLS existence. It's okay. It's still worth it. You still take that deal every time. I get all that. But for the Whitecaps to be on a supporter shield pace, I mean, no one saw that coming, let alone doing it while making a CCC run without so many of the key players, with such an incredibly aesthetically pleasing, assertive, proactive game model where they're doing, they're outpassing some of the best teams on the continent. It's amazing. And there's, and again, you mentioned the travel. Every year, the Whitecaps are always first in terms of the travel miles in MLS, just because of their geographic location. And then you look at they've gone to Costa Rica, they've gone to Mexico twice in CCC, they've had to go to Miami, which is
the longest place you can go in MLS.
In MLS, it's incredible. And I was told today that the 9 international call-ups are going to leave straight from Mexico. So yes, a highly underhanded group that the Sounders get to play. So, but like they came back from, I think it was one of the Liga MX teams they beat. I think it was when they. I mean, I think the high point. You can say that beating Miami in both legs and to do so as emphatically as they did was maybe the high point. But for me, it was going to Mexico City at high altitude, needing a result, having only drawn in the home leg, and coming back, keeping pace with Pumas, and then taking I believe it was an 88th minute equalizer that was the aggregate winner for Pumas, and then to go back and get into the box in injury time and have your center back, Tristan Blackman, score your winner with an absolute banger, roof of the net type thing. I mean, it's like, and remember too, on top of all of this, and I know I'm prattling on here, but it was widely perceived by the local marketplace that this team was going to get moved. The doom and gloom when they announced in the winter that this team was going to be put up for sale was incredible. I remember thinking, and I think it's something about Canada. Granted, they have the example of the Grizzlies. The NBA's Grizzlies were a very painful and there was a lot of duplicitousness on the part of ownership in terms of the lead up to them moving to Memphis. But every Canadian market, I think, that has a U.S. based league in it, a team in a U.S. based league, is convinced that that any market in the U.S., because of the exchange rate and the media marketplace and so forth, is going to be superior to them. And people were saying they're going to be the Indianapolis Whitecaps. I mean, people were telling me this, this gloomy kind of outlook on things. And I talked to Axel Schuster for a big feature I did about this story a few weeks ago. And he was talking about how kind of frustrating it was that no matter what they said, no matter how much they emphasized, that nothing like that was in the current plans. And granted, people can change, stuff that it remains to be seen who's going to buy the organization and so forth. But for all, as far as we can tell, MLS wisely, I think, realizes this is a world city. This is a place where they need to be. This is a place with a big corporate presence, a lot of money in that city, incredibly dyed-in-the-wool football and culture, and all those things matter, right? And you're seeing it. I mean, when I interviewed Sebastian Berhalter a few weeks ago, he said, I think it was in the first leg of the Miami series when the Southsiders did a tifo that said, sorry, I'm paraphrasing, I may not nail it, but he's basically, you've allowed us to dream again. And he said, I had to compose myself in the pregame anthem lineup when I read that, because he got emotional that there was that sort of connection between the fans, and those fans have lived through some stuff, right? I mean, compared especially to the Sounders fans who generally had things pretty good in MLS, Whitecaps have gotten kicked around. They've had scandal. They've had disappointment. They've had coaching relationships turn sour. They've had players want away players. They've had all kinds of. They've had every negative aspect, I think, of the MLS experience you can have in the decade plus they've been around. So it's just beautiful to see them, the team, the organization, and the city just kind of vibe in this way.
Yeah, I've been saying, obviously, I'm a little closer to this than you, I guess. But I think Vancouver's a world-class city. I don't think I'm saying anything crazy by saying that it's a world-class city. I've all along said that this is like one of the sleeping giants in North American soccer. Like they are, like the Vancouver market is a very soccer savvy market. They understand the game. They understand the sport. They understand what the Whitecaps are. And I think in some ways that's maybe hurt the Whitecaps specifically because they have a fan. There's a lot of soccer fans there, but there's a lot of soccer fans that are committed to other teams already. And I think that sometimes they get unfairly, like when in Seattle, for whatever reason, there's not a huge number of people who are comparing us to the Premier League all the time. Whereas I get the sense that, and maybe it's because it's Canada and it's just sort of it's culturally closer to England, but I do feel like that the Whitecaps sort of suffer that comparison, and they've not helped themselves by being an aggressively mediocre at best team for most of their existence. And so it's you see how many people showed up to watch the Champions Cup semifinal against Miami, where I believe they completely sold out BC Place, which was an amazing thing to see, because that is a venue that can be amazing on its day. And it's going to be a little sad for me personally if they end up moving out of downtown and they move to I believe it's Empire Field, where they played their first season, or the grounds of Empire Field where they played their first season on I think it's the old Expo, or the old fairgrounds in any case. And it's not in downtown, and I'm sure it'll be great, but I will be a little sad if they end up moving, because I do think BC Place has a lot of potential to be like a really great venue in MLS. But I'm also really hopeful that this does, even though they are rivals, I think, today there was a funny little line at the end of the press conference with Brian Schmetzer where they asked him about, what his interests will be in watching both the Champions League final, where Inter Milan is playing PSG. PSG, of course, will be playing the Sounders in the Club World Cup. And then on Sunday, watching Cruz Azul play the Whitecaps, and of course, knowing that the Sounders are going to be playing Whitecaps. And he just said, he's like, look, we're all a fan of Canada. And then he took a pause and kind of hoping that the cameras turned off. And he said, unlike our president. And it was just kind of this funny line where it's like, I do think that the Sounders as an organization just fundamentally view the Whitecaps differently. And anyway, I don't know why the point of that was, other than to share that little anecdote.
Third wheel no more, right?
Right, exactly.
I mean that's always been the third wheel accusation of Cascadia.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's true also to a degree. Like, I just don't think anyone feels the antipathy for the Whitecaps that the Sounders and Timbers feel for each other. That's for sure. And anyway, so it's just fascinating to see. I'm sure Ryan Gold will come back just in time for the Sounders game and probably put up a hat trick and just and carry them to victory, because that's the way this Whitecap season is going. But you just look at their last game, and here they give up 2 early goals to RSL. It's on the road. They have bigger fish to fry. What do they pack it in? Who cares, right? And what do? They come out
at altitude,
at altitude, and then they tie it up before halftime. Even Brian White gets a brace before halftime, and then Pedro Vite comes in with a 90-minute winner that seems to just be sort of illustrative of this team right now. You cannot count them out. You talk about the Pumas game. That was probably the one game this year where they've been outplayed pretty significantly. Like they were, and when Pumas scored that goal, it did feel like, oh, it was a nice run that they had. And then 5 minutes later, here's Tristan Blackman pulling a goal out of absolutely nowhere. And they do seem to,
I think I trailed off. Did I even say earlier, like the incredible thing is they come back home and they all said afterwards they were exhausted, and they gave Austin 5 goals 3 days later.
Right.
Or maybe it was 2 days later, whatever it was. The flight gets in from Mexico at 2 a.m. And when Austin has, up to that point in particular, it was and is a respectable defensive unit, and they absolutely torched them at BC Place. So, you got to love it. Again, this game's capacity to surprise is a wonderful thing about it.
Yeah, and I would say that the Whitecaps, more than any other team this year, have been springing these surprises and sort of like reminding everyone that it's not about the names on the front of the jersey, or it's not about the names on the back of jersey. Heck, it might not even be about the name on the front of the jersey. It's just sometimes they got to have a belief in what they're doing. And they do seem to have this level of belief that is frankly amazing and very impressive. And, I wish them the worst of luck when the Sounders play them, but I can't help but admire what they're doing as long as they're not facing the Sounders. And unlike if the Timbers were like, when I was on Scuffed a few weeks ago, and they asked me what my rooting interest was in the CONCACAF Champions Cup final, and I said I'm rooting for the Whitecaps. I love to see the Whitecaps doing well, as long as it's not at the Sounders' expense. And I feel like that's probably the case in this game. And who knows? Maybe the hangover will help the Sounders too if they win this thing. And I also think it's kind of
you guys
fitting.
Have been there, done that,
right? And also, there's something very fitting about the only 2 the only two MLS teams to win the modern era of the CONCACAF champions, CONCA champions, I guess is what we've decided to call this now, right? Is two teams from Cascadia, and not one of them being the Timbers. Is just really kind of would be really kind of wonderful.
Well, I am. You've got me excited for Sounders Caps, and I do think this first one will probably be a little bit short of the peak of what it could be. But they play again in the heat of the stretch run on September 27th, 28th, something like that.
Well, you haven't circled that on your calendar
in
yet,
Seattle. So that one should be good. If we may not get full lift off this time around, but who knows, man? I mean, maybe the Caps have got some homegrowns and two guys that are just ready to tear it up.
Yeah, I will say the Whitecaps too just destroyed the Defiance the other day, so I wouldn't necessarily put that past them to have something in the tank for this one. But Charlie, I can't thank you enough for doing this on short notice. I will also tease that you are going to be doing some content for Sounder at Heart around the Club World Cup. So if people liked what they heard from you, we're going to be getting more of it this summer in the next few weeks. So it's been great.
Let's go
doing this. Yeah, exactly.
I finally got the call.
Exactly.
To the real website.
Exactly. That's what we like to hear. That way to butter me up there. I appreciate that. Well, Charlie, where else other than MLS Soccer, where else can people follow you? And of course, Sounder at Heart.
Yeah. So I'm spending most of my social media time on Blue Sky these days. What am I? Gosh, it's something or other. But I think it's Boehm. Anyway, it's on there.
We'll link it in the show notes.
Boehm. Yeah, there you go. And then get at me. You can write me a line there. The Twitter is I check in and get my mail every once in a while, but it's like it's a hellscape. But if you hit me up there, I'll respond eventually. But Blue Sky is where it's at. So
awesome.
Boehm at bsky.social. Great.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again for doing this. I am Jeremiah Oshan, signing off for Charlie Boehm on Nos Audietes, part of the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network. And of course, thank you to our sponsor, Full Pool Wines. We're going to catch you next time, hopefully very soon. Talk later.
I expect a LAFC who's motivated to prove themselves at home, to prove to their fans that they're capable of winning in this league. And it's up to us to really brew in the party. You guys like that? No? Awkward joke, dad joke right there, huh?